All right. So this class shows us how to paint Pikachu under a warm bounce light type of scenario. And we're using Heavy Paint Classic. I'm going to give a brief overview of what the class is about so that you can get a sense of what we're covering before we actually get into the nitty-gritty details. So this image that you see here was painted in Heavy Paint Classic. It took me about 2 hours and a half from start to finish, and I did it all in on location in plain air. Um, you can see that there's a lot of progress that has been done within the first few seconds of this time lapse, and then it tends to like really slow down to like a crawl. Um, a lot of times, a lot of artists will enjoy the really exciting start of a painting where you're doing a lot of progress, and then they will never get to the polishing stage because it's a lot of repetitive operations, and it can be very difficult to even know if you're making any progress unless you're specifically painting with an intent. Um, so some of what we're going to cover in the class is to explain what the intent is every step of the way, so that polishing doesn't feel like we're just going off on a tangent, but there's a very clear purpose for what we're doing. Right? So this is a picture I took of the location where it was at. The picture does not represent what I perceived with my eyes, and it's a problem with digital cameras, especially iPhone. If we took this with a proper camera, I'm sure that the values wouldn't feel so clipped. You can see the area here where Pikachu's is in the bright light. They're just blown out. There's barely any information there. So that's unfortunate. That's not what it looked like when I was there in person. So I'm going to show how to start from a very flat color and ignoring what you know has a lot more complexity just so you can get started. So blocking in just a flat shade of something that represents what you're seeing, but not getting lost in details right away because there's you have to start somewhere, right? So sometimes squinting can be a good way to reduce the amount of detail that is in front of you and just get to the average color in front of you. Um, so here, this might be my favorite part of the class. We actually explain this sort of saturated transition edge that we often see in people's paintings. So here I painted this hypothetical wooden floor, right? And a very sharp sunlight hitting it. And you can see that in the region where the sunlight hits, the local color of the wood is gone. All we're seeing is a near white uh, color. And we call it color even though it's nearly white. And white is the absence of color, right? So how do we get this saturated edge? Well, the saturated edge is the true color of the light actually being exposed. And what I mean by that is that if we were to just simply underexpose the whole image, we would see the color throughout, right? We'd be able to see that there's even like variation within the shape. Like we could see like a specular highlight of the sun onto the wood, right? But because the image is so bright, um, it just removes all local color and it washes out the actual true color of the light. So we only get to see it in the underexposed bits here where the sunlight is making its way into shadow. So the penumbra appears to be saturated just because we're finally able to expose for it. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them on the Discord channel. So anyway, um, then I go over how to block in the Pikachu in this case, and why I'm picking a value group that is purposely darker than the visible sunlight here. And I explain it's because we want to make sure that two value groups are separated and there's a clear hierarchy between them. We want to make sure that the visible sunlight is the dominant light source that can motivate the bounce, the lights Pikachu. So because all the light on Pikachu is bounce light from the sunlight, it cannot possibly be brighter than the sunlight because the sunlight is the source of light on Pikachu, if that makes sense. So I go over some of those principles and why they're important. Here is just us making more progress, fleshing out the silhouette of the character. I forgot to mention that here we established a cast shadow, and the cast shadow is really important to place Pikachu in a 3D space. Without it, it could be floating in the air, right? We wouldn't know. Then here I show um, how we're blocking in the local color and why it's important to have some, what I call, I guess, landmarks uh, that can help us place this figure in 3D space. So knowing that there's like a virtual line between the eyes and the two cheeks, we can um, we can make sure that the perspective is right before we get into like describing the form or any detail that will be a shame to repaint over and over because we didn't get the perspective right. So this method of laying down some landmarks can be very helpful to establish a foundation we can work on and refine later on. This is us just breaking down some of those shapes, and then here we get to something very important, and that's why I made a GIF because it can be tricky to find out exactly what has changed. But you can see that we're improving on the form of the character, and the belly and the forehead are getting a little brighter. But it's important to know that even though they're getting brighter, if we color pick them, they're still ever so slightly darker on Pikachu than they are on the floor, on the ground, in that table. Because again, what we're seeing on Pikachu is a reflection of the sunlight, so it can never be brighter than the sunlight itself. And that's why it's important that we establish these value groups initially, and then we can sculpt them, give them form, but never to the point where they exit the initial value group. Otherwise, you will get situation where Pikachu is brighter than the sunlight is supposed to be illuminating it, and it can start to feel very staged. This is just more polishing, and then we get to this part, which is one of my favorites, where we use the lasso blur to essentially pick what edges we're going to keep sharp and what edges we're going to soften. And if we're dealing with a gradual plane change, something soft, we should lose the hard edge. If we're dealing with a very sharp corner or local color, something recognizable that you wouldn't want to blur because it describes a change in local color, like a textural quality of something, and you wouldn't want to lose it. So you can see I'm leaving alone landmarks on the face, the eyes, the nose, but I'm blurring areas where the form we're describing is a soft form. And this is very important because we want our strokes to mean something. We don't want to have contrast everywhere. So we want to end up eventually in a place where our strokes are soft if they describe soft form, and our strokes are hard if they describe sudden plane changes. Here we added a little bit more specular highlights. Oh, this is an interesting concept. The specular highlights on the eyes can feel cooler than their surroundings, but just because the image is so warm, even just moving closer towards gray gives them the appearance of being cooler. That's an important concept, the relativity of color. Here we're just adding more shape onto Pikachu. Um, and we really gifts at this point because the changes are so subtle that you wouldn't really know that you've made progress unless you're very deliberate about what you're working on. So here you can see that in this region, the tail got a little warmer in this area to suggest bounce from Pikachu's onto the tail in areas that are closer to the sunlit area when where Pikachu is getting more bounce, right? We're also adding more specular hits on his chest. We're just refining some of those edges that were a little rough. We're improving on some of the accuracy of our form, how the ear attaches to the head. So just lots of very small improvements that all add up. And we just keep on going, improving on the specular highlights here. So there, if there's a very sharp change in planes, specular highlight will be tighter. Whereas if there's a more gradual change in a plane, a specular highlight will have more room to grow. Um, and yeah, just like more very subtle variation where if one goes before and after, you can barely tell that there's progress. But when you add it all up, you can see that we're adding more definition under the chin. Uh, we're refining some of those edges, so we're softening them. We are refining the shapes of the specular highlights, so they're a little brighter, a little bit more neutral. Just lots of very tiny refinements. And eventually we end up in a place where we can fake the full field using the lasso blur. Um, and we also added a little bit more bounce light from Pikachu's chest onto the ground. And you can see how it makes it look so much more integrated when we do that. I added tiny little specks on the ground here so that when we apply the full field, having some areas still being sharp, picking up some details here and there,